analysed our spending totals. We were waiting to see what happened on the economy. Arguably, we should have done the spending review, but personally, in my view, the spending share we'd got to in the last few years, that view of the role of government is the right view, and I personally think that we should not be dramatically reducing spending rather than raising taxes to get the deficit down. I think we need a combination of some tough spending decisions, but also to defend the tax rises which we put in place, which they are now trying to reverse. And listen, if we don't defend the programmes in spending which deliver fairness and social justice in the health service, in education, but also in our local communities, around caring, around home helps, we will end up taking ourselves backwards in terms of social justice, not forward. The reality is we've got to stand against their neoliberalism by defending the role of the state and government, and that means defending public spending.
I'll take another woman. Yes, over there. Wait a minute, wait for a microphone.
I've got two questions about education. The first is, could you all tell us whether you'll be voting with or against the coalition on the Academies bill, and if so, why? And the second is that you've all spoken very powerfully about poorer children. So I wonder what you would all do as leader in the 25% of local authorities where children still face selective entry tests to secondary schools, which always discriminates against the poorest children.
Diane, it's your turn to start.
I've not seen the text of the Academies bill, but if it's anything like Michael Gove is saying, then it needs to be opposed. Because the only way that we can drive up standards in education is, of course, partly the commitment of parents and children and teachers, but you also need strong local education authorities to take the thing forward. And under their Academies proposal, it would be each school for itself, and inevitably, those, and they wouldn't be genuine academies in any event, those academies in the more advantaged middle-class areas would thrive, but children in areas like mine would find themselves worse off than ever. It was a step backwards for children in London when the Tories abolished the London Education Authority. And London was a real step backwards. And many London boroughs are still struggling to get back from that. And the introduction of the academies, as Michael Gove has described them, would be yet another blow for the education of children in areas like mine. I mean, selective schools are undoubtedly an issue, Fiona. But one thing I've spent a lot of time on in the past 10 years is how you raise underachievement amongst black and ethnic minority children. And I think it's very important going forward, if we're able to save our LEAs and save the structure we have a focus on making sure that all children rising 16 and going on to college can fulfill their potential, because we have a situation where black and Asian and white children are coming in aged 5 and then a gap emerges. It's partly about class, but it's partly about other issues. And unless we target those underachieving children, particularly boys, whatever type of school they're in, we will continue to see the social and the community consequences of willfully letting a group of our children, not just on grounds of class, but also on grounds of colour, fail. That is not what my socialism is about.
David.
Fiona, you know that when I was Minister for Schools, probably in the same way that Ed did when he was Secretary of State for Schools, Ed Balls, we dedicated ourselves to ensuring that those in the greatest need and those from the poorest families got the greatest help in achieving an education that actually made the most of their talents. And the Academies programme was founded to deliver that. And in 200 schools around the country, the most chronic underachievement has been addressed not by just a new sixth form block or a new head or a new lick of paint, but actually a new approach to the schooling in those communities. And that's one reason that the Academies have delivered faster than average improvement in the results right around the country, not because they've got more money, but because they've approached the business of educational improvement in a different way. I fully support Ed Balls' decision to increase the number of academies around the country. I think that's the right thing to do. I think it's very, very important that we never accept that children in the poorest areas should be condemned to continual underachievement. I think also in that context, we should therefore condemn the Gove attempt to water down what academies are designed to achieve. Because what Michael Gove is doing is saying we're not going to dedicate the greatest educational transformation to those children in the poorest areas. We're going to say to those schools that are already doing very, very well, we're going to give you extra advantages. And that seems to me to be an upside-down way of approaching the educational problem that this country has got. Now, it's very, very important that we remember that in 1997, 1,600 schools out of 3,500 secondary schools in England were getting less than 5 A to C's at GCSE. That figure is now down to 260. 260 too many, but still 260, and a massive reduction from the 1,600. But we have to carry on that absolutely relentless drive to ensure that the poorest kids in the poorest schools get the best opportunities. In respect of grammar schools, it's ironic that we're addressing that in this institution and actually in this hall, because it's here that Tony Crosland came in 1965 to talk about how he would reconcile the competing socialist values of, on the one hand, his words, comprehensive education, and on the other hand, local empowerment. And he gave a speech which set out how it was impossible to ensure that as Secretary of State, he decided on the admissions policy of every school in the country. And he said instead that it should be a local decision forged between local authorities and local people. And he refused to take power to himself. And that's why we've got 165 grammar schools out of 3,500 secondary schools around the country. And I think the only way in which we can address this problem, and like Ed, I went to a comprehensive school and I will defend to my dying day both the comprehensive principle of comprehensive admissions and the comprehensive commitment to serving the needs of every single child in the classroom. But I will not promise in this hall where Tony Crosland spoke that I will centralise the decisions on the grammar school comprehensive issue. It's got to be resolved locally through fair ballots and through a fair way of organising things.
I just want to start by addressing the issue of academies, and I want to basically agree with most of what David said on this. I know some people in this audience won't like that, but I just want to say this, because I've seen this up close as a constituency MP. There was an early generation of academies where some people who became part of the educational system, that I understand why the concerns there were about some of those people, and we acknowledge those concerns. But I've also seen, thanks in part to the changes that Ed Balls made, the new generation of academies, including one in my own constituency, which actually has come out of a partnership with a school in Ed's constituency. And I do say to this audience, that was about huge educational investment in some of the poorest kids in our society, and they have made a difference. And I just tell you that honestly as a constituency MP, and that maybe necessarily wasn't my view when I became a constituency MP, but I've seen that myself. Now, of course, local authorities have a central role to play in education, and that's what Ed tried to do when he was Education Secretary, bring academies back under the wing of local authorities. And the problem with Gove's plan is it is actually designed to increase educational inequality, because it is going to say to those schools that are already outstanding, quite the opposite from the original programme, to those schools that are already outstanding, we're just going to set you free from the system. And it is an ideological view about local authorities and getting local authorities out of education, so Fiona, we should oppose it. On the question around grammar schools, again, this is a very difficult issue, we should be honest about it. I think there are issues, as I understand it, around the balloting procedures and who gets to vote in these local ballots, and whether it is a fair selection of people, not selection is the wrong word, a fair group of people in the local area who get to vote, and whether it genuinely represents a cross-section of local parents. Final point I would make, Fiona, because you asked about how we tackle educational underachievement. And again, this is difficult because we're going to be, even in the middle of this decade, we won't have massive amounts of resources. My big priority for educational investment would be the under fives, because everything we know is that is where, that is how we equalise. That is how we equalise educational opportunity. Both Ed Balls and myself and some other members of the panel have said also we're interested in the principle, I support the principle of a graduate tax as well, but as far as extra educational investment is concerned, I think it needs to go into the early years.